Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Missed Opportunities, Assessing and Leveraging Requirements, Incentives, and Trade-offs in Affordable Housing Development. My name is Mike Kinsella, and I am the CEO of Up for Growth. For those of you who don't know us, Up for Growth is a 501c3 cross-sector member network committed to solving the housing shortage and affordability crisis through data-driven research and evidence-based policy. As you all know, the nation faces a severe housing crisis, driven in large part by an unprecedented shortage or underproduction of homes. In the past decade, despite years of economic growth, housing starts have approached the lowest levels in history. And this level of underproduction has resulted in a shortage of 7.3 million homes, short of meeting housing needs from 2000 to 2015. Quite simply, housing production is not keeping pace with housing need. Artificial barriers, exclusionary zoning, and opposition from residents, or NIMBYism, often combine to create this severe shortage of homes, a major driver of the national affordability crisis. And these unjust policies that drive the shortage continue to drive working families, people with low incomes, and people of color out of the highest opportunity areas, places that are rich in jobs, transportation, and infrastructure. In fact, racial discrimination has been embedded into housing policy for over a century and is a main driver of today's housing shortage across the country. To create access to housing and a housing system that serves everyone, Up for Growth believes that policymakers must prioritize racial and economic equity outcomes and actively work to reverse the nation's history of exclusionary policies and patterns. We're very excited to have more than 100 attendees on the line for our presentation and webinar today, which I think underscores how critical inclusionary housing policy and property tax exemption tools are to achieving housing equity, eliminating these systemic barriers, and ultimately creating more homes. So welcome again to Up for Growth's second in a series of our annual webinar program. Before I hand it over to our series sponsor, Jennifer LeSar of Global Policy Leadership Academy, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the American Planning Association, and our episode sponsor, architecture firm ZGF. Before we proceed into the program, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer LeSar.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you live. My name is Jennifer LeSar, and I'm the founder of the Global Policy Leadership Academy, where we prepare for professionals and civic leaders to advance solutions to intractable societal challenges, including our housing crisis. We do this through a deep commitment to the development of shared knowledge, best practices, and collaboration. And through our programs, we're working to expand and develop networks of informed, passionate problem solvers committed to creating a more equitable, sustainable world for us all. Which brings me to why we're gathered here today. Our work aligns closely with the mission and work of the passionate problem solvers at Up for Growth, where I also serve on the board. Our Up for Growth team is committed to the use of data, research, and stakeholder engagement towards solving one of the most urgent challenges of our time, our nation's housing, affordable housing, and housing underproduction crisis. Up for Growth's latest policy brief examines the interplay of incentives and requirements that typically comprise inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning policies across the country. With hundreds of jurisdictions nationwide adopting and implementing these policies, today Up for Growth presents vital research indicating that multi-stakeholder consensus is emerging around inclusionary housing policies that support building mixed income housing with lasting affordability. In addition, Up for Growth's research identifies an ideal mix of incentives and requirements that communities might use to maximize the production of affordable housing across regions, neighborhoods, and markets. To that end, the Global Policy Leadership Academy is proud to partner today with Up for Growth as a local series sponsor for our webinar. Our panel members today will have a relevant and timely discussion concerning real solutions to the affordable housing development crisis in the United States and the complex public policy that surrounds that. The Global Policy Leadership Academy is proud to support this endeavor, so without further ado, Mike, let me turn the microphone back to you to outline the policy brief and our findings in more details and help set the stage for the panelists' conversation today.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks so much for that introduction, and of course for your partnership and support. And before I dive into the walkthrough of the policy brief that Jennifer shared, I just want to say, we really appreciate the leadership of the Global Policy Leadership Academy and the great work that they're doing out in California, educating a new cohort of leaders in the housing policy space, and very much appreciate the collaboration that we have with Jennifer in particular as a board member. So thank you so much. As Jennifer mentioned, I not only serve as the Chief Executive Officer of Up for Growth, but also worked as the principal author of this policy brief, the first in a new series of Up for Growth policy analysis to inform the national conversation around solutions to achieving housing equity, eliminating systemic barriers, and ultimately creating more homes. I would also like to thank Anjali Kalachulam, who is not able to join us today, but Anjali is our senior policy analyst, plays an active role and is underway on producing our second policy brief, which we will showcase at a future webinar later this year. So today I've been asked to walk through some of the more specific details of the brief to help set the stage for our fantastic panel today. So if we go to the next slide. Right. Before we dive too deep into the weeds, I want to begin by discussing the groundwork of how inclusionary policies and typically property tax exemption policies work and operate. Affordability incentives generally work in two major ways, or you can think of it as under two different categories. One's physical and one's financial. For the physical benefits, lawmakers and local planners may do things like allowing more density, increasing height limits to enable developers to build more units on a given parcel of land, or increasing density zoning to allow for a greater supply of housing built in an area and again on a particular site. There's some great research on this topic, which we note later on in the presentation, which will be made available to all of you after the webinar. But for today, today's discussion is going to really focus on the financial benefits. So financial incentives or programs typically include tax abatements for a set period of time, often between 10 to 20 years. Localities can also reduce or waive or even finance impact fees to encourage housing producers to build more affordable housing. Now, you may be wondering why it is worth it for local jurisdictions to engage in this practice at all. The reality is building and operating multifamily and affordable housing is very expensive for cities, townships, and the public sector. Incentivizing market rate or for-profit developers into building mixed income housing is a good deal for cities, even if it costs the foregone revenue of tax dollars that these developers would have to pay. It's still a better trade or a more economical way to subsidize and produce affordable housing, again, particularly in mixed income and high opportunity neighborhoods, as the panelists will get into further in their discussion. If we could go to the next slide. When discussing housing affordability, there are a few significant terms that we want to keep in mind. We want you to keep in mind as we move through the conversation today. Often, these policies include set-aside requirements, which refer to how many of the project's total units built must be affordable or at a certain rate at below market housing costs. Lawmakers can also prioritize the depth of affordability, which defines the affordabilities based on household income thresholds. Often this number means between 60% to 80% of median family income. An MFI is calculated by ordering all households in an ascending income order and then identifying the middle or the median income where half of the households in an area earn more and half earn less. Other nuances exist as we continue to think about the issue, namely the length of affordability. Some policies, including the Portland policy that I'll be describing shortly, ask that the property remain affordable for 99 years. On the next slide, to help provide a broader sense of states' actions on inclusionary housing policies across the country, let's take a quick look at this map. Many states across the country, but especially states with high cost of living like California or New York, have introduced inclusionary housing programs. The map on the right side of the screen shows how many inclusionary programs and policies exist state by state. Again, to note, states with particularly high costs of living, like New York, have many more programs and policies than states, say, like Michigan or Ohio, where the cost of living and the cost of land are relatively cheaper on average. Next slide, please. Now, inclusionary housing conversations are often depicted as binary choices. People or policymakers are often for inclusionary housing policies, or they are seemingly against it. We wanted to make sure that we highlight the nuances that exist within this conversation, or could exist within this conversation. Take the chart on the left, which measures the cost per household of different types of inclusionary housing options. Building extremely low-income housing is often particularly resource intensive, as communities will either need to increase incentives for private developers or need to create and maintain this affordable housing themselves. Building missing middle or more moderate income housing costs relatively less per household. It's important for communities to ensure that low-income housing may be built and middle-income housing is built, so lawmakers should carefully consider, their communities' needs as they build out policies that create more affordable housing options. Indeed, what we also found is that this is complicated and a nuanced conversation, but there is space to engage a broad stakeholder group in conversations around calibrating tax abatement policy to increase affordable or below market rate rental units. Advocates and activists, we believe, should focus on these areas of overlap, which might help broaden political will and build consensus for meaningful solutions to get at a mix of incomes and more affordable homes in market rate communities. That is not the only area of consensus, though. Among Up for Growth members, which includes a broad coalition of policymakers, advocacy organizations, and practitioners, we found that 60% prioritize maximizing the number of affordable homes over achieving deeper levels of affordability through these policies. We also found that maximizing the ideal ratio of abatements and depth of affordability vary significantly based on locality and should be thoughtfully considered. Again, to highlight, this is not an area with a simple yes or no binary solution. This space has room for thoughtful discussion on how to best prioritize interests to ensure that more affordable units and mixed income developments are being supported. To get a bit more granular, let's take a look at our test case, Portland, Oregon's inclusionary housing program. The city created a requirement for all newly constructed developments with 20 or more units to have a 10% set aside at 60% of median family income. To provide further context, the median family income in 2021 was $96,900 per year, and 60% of that is $58,000 roughly per year, which is a higher salary than, for example, a majority of office workers and teachers in the city. This is workforce housing. They also had a 99-year affordability requirement, which speaks to the concept of length of affordability we discussed earlier. This policy in the city of Portland was implemented in 2017. What we found after taking a close look at the Portland experience is that the city has an opportunity to maximize inclusionary housing production, but the policy is not currently calibrated to maximize for the number of affordable homes produced. That said, the effectiveness of increasing the duration of tax exemptions on the 10% set aside decreases over time. If you take a look at the graph on the upper right of this slide, it shows that increasing the tax exemption period to 22 years on all units in the building could double the number of income restricted affordable homes set aside in new development, again, at a 99-year duration, effectively permanent affordability. If other cities or municipalities take a similar look at their individual or state level inclusionary policies, they may find that similar changes and leveraging similar policies to the Oregon Tax Exemption Authority can help them develop a larger supply of both affordable homes as well as market rate homes. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our policy brief overview. On this slide, you'll find a few guiding questions that will help frame the panel discussion to come. Additionally, in the appendix of this deck, which will be emailed to all registrants after today's webinar, we've included a glossary of terms that we use throughout the deck and some further reading on the subject. Without further ado, I want to pass the virtual mic over to the presenting sponsor of the Up for Growth 2022 Pro Housing webinar series, the American Planning Association. Jason Jordan, who has been Director of Public Policy and Government Relations for APA over 15 years, will provide additional perspectives on the value of this conversation and introduce our phenomenal panel. We at Up for Growth appreciate APA's continued support of our ongoing webinar series. And personally, Jason, I just want to thank you for the collaboration that we've built over the past 2 years. We look forward to continuing this dialogue with you all and our partnership on advancing pro-housing partnerships across the United States. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate those kind words of introduction. We're certainly delighted to be a strong partner with Up for Growth in tackling the nation's housing crisis. Let me add my word of welcome on behalf of the American Planning Association. APA is the nation's voice of professional planners and local planning leaders. We focus on research, education, and advocacy around building great communities for all, and we're certainly proud to be a sponsor of this important webinar series. Housing opportunity and zoning reform are critical priorities for not only APA, but for the nation. And while a big part of our work with Up for Growth is focused on identifying and advancing federal and state solutions, we absolutely recognize the necessity of local leadership and particularly the role of planners in helping drive that leadership. We know it's not enough to just acknowledge that a housing crisis exists. And we recognize that too often the conversation around the housing crisis tends to lead us to a fairly polarized debate and a fairly simplistic evaluation of options. This moment really demands a focus, as Mike indicated, on solutions, on where we can find real impact that makes real change in real people's lives in communities. And that really requires an openness to taking a look at what's working, what the trade-offs are, what the implication of different policy options are. And that leads us to today's discussion, which I'm very excited about. We were excited about the research that Mike just walked through. We think it's a particularly important moment to really evaluate where we're going with inclusionary housing and zoning policy and understanding how to calibrate those policies in a way to achieve the outcomes that people want. I know you're going to get some terrific insights ahead, a lot of on-the-ground practical perspectives on this topic, which our moderator knows absolutely well firsthand. So I'm going to introduce him, and then he will lead us into the panel discussion. Our moderator for the panel today is Sam Diaz. Sam is the executive director of the organization Thousand Friends of Oregon. Before he took the reins at Thousand Friends of Oregon, he was a senior policy advisor to the mayor of Portland. And as you heard from Mike's introduction, Portland has a lot of experience and insights to offer in this particular area. He's also got some state level experience in his background as a staffer in the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So Sam is really well positioned to guide our conversation as we go forward. Again, thanks for being part of the conversation, and I look forward to the rest of the webinar. Take it away, Sam.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thanks to the Up for Growth team for organizing this. I just want to say, Thousand Friends of Oregon, before my time, was part of a statewide coalition to remove, in part, the 2016 the blanket ban on inclusionary housing at the state level, so that local communities across Oregon can have the conversation we're having today. So I'd be remiss not to say thank you to the coalition and our elected officials for making that change so we can have this conversation with you all across the nation. So you've been able to read the policy brief. You've heard the highlight reel of the policy brief from Mike. So now it's time to hear from our panelists to help us connect this research to our own communities. And then we'll segue into Q&A. So please use the chat feature in case you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists. And then those will be sent directly to me, and I'll make sure to queue them up for our Q&A. Before we dive into the conversation, can I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, where they're zooming in from, and please share any challenges and opportunities to advance housing availability and affordability that are happening in your work and community that you think are helpful so people understand the context you're thinking about in this conversation. I'll go to you, David, first for the introduction.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel today. My name is David Williams. I'm a real estate lawyer by training, but I served in the mayor's office in Detroit. Kind of more recently, I helped build out the policy arm for a think tank called Opportunity Insights based at Harvard. And I've been working on some social impact housing models and have been in the investment investment space. And I think the two angles that I'm really interested in talking about and exploring today are one, kind of really understanding and also emphasizing, I think, the social impact that policies have that really kind of increase access to affordable housing in high opportunity areas. And then two, really thinking about how policies like inclusionary housing and others can help city leaders think holistically about their housing challenges and other policies and other policy priorities as well. But looking forward to the conversation. And I'm zooming in from Harlem, New York, but I'm a Detroiter by heart and soul.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Sarah, we'll go to you next.
Great. Thanks, Sam. I'm Sarah Meyerson, and I am a managing director at M Squared, which is a women-owned impact investing platform focused on the ground-up development and investment in mixed-income multifamily housing. So really the type of housing we're talking about, inclusionary policies encouraging. Prior to my time at M Squared, and in my prior life, I'm an urban planner by training and was the director of planning for the city of Boston for 4 years. I think, a couple of things that I'm particularly excited about with this policy brief is one, how we can think about inclusionary policies expanding beyond the high cost cities where they may thrive today. I think, I sit in Massachusetts currently, and we have 138 inclusionary policies on that map compared to some of the other states. But also thinking about how inclusionary can live alongside other housing policies to address the full spectrum of housing needs beyond where policies existing today are addressing them. So how can we move beyond, the low-income housing tax credit world and the NOAA world to have other tools in place to really address that full spectrum as the housing crisis continues to be exacerbated across the country. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Sarah. And last but not least, Matthew.
Thanks, Sam, and good morning, everybody. I am zooming in from Portland, Oregon. My name is Matthew Schaubold, and I work in housing policy and housing equity for the City Housing Bureau. The Housing Bureau is primarily a housing finance agency, and we also administer some of the city's housing regulations, including the inclusionary housing program. And I think the thing that I'm looking forward to in this conversation is a little bit of what Mike talked about, which is our ability to have a nuanced conversation about inclusionary housing programs, inclusionary housing policies, how they fit into the spectrum of housing interventions we have to try and increase housing supply and housing affordability. And I want to thank Sam. I want to thank you for moderating the discussion today. I'm looking forward to it. I want to make sure to thank Up for Growth and the people that are joining the webinar. And I also want to say thank you to Mike Kinsella. I've known Mike for a few years. He was working in Portland when the city was developing its inclusionary housing program. And I can say that he definitely is committed to the nuanced conversation of how do we get into the detail of the program structure and move beyond a binary conversation?
Here, here. Thanks so much, Matthew. All right, so as you can tell from just their introductions, we have a real treat that Up for Growth lined up for us. So we have a panel of housing policy leaders and financing experts that bring different vantage points to this conversation. So let's get started. I have a question for you, David. You mentioned in your introduction social impact. And can you just kind of educate us on what in the brief, what findings matter from your viewpoint about social impact? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned some of the work I did at Opportunity Insights, and a lot of that was using big data to understand the impact of various range of policies. And kind of a lot of our research was focused on the importance of place. And so what we saw is using longitudinal IRS and Census Bureau data is that something that I think is probably fairly intuitive to a lot of us, that neighborhoods really do matter, right? Where you grow up has an impact on your long-term outcomes. But I think what we saw is that it's really tangible, right? It's something that based on where you grow up, the same kind of kid coming from the same circumstances can have very different outcomes that we can literally track 10, 15, 20 years down the road based on that neighborhood environment. I think it's important to keep that in mind when we have conversations about inclusionary housing or other policies that really can help hopefully increase access to a broader range of neighborhoods for low-income families. Because I think oftentimes what we see is that right through a range of different housing policies that support affordable housing, oftentimes these resources are concentrated in higher poverty places that really don't increase economic mobility prospects or economic opportunity. So I think policies that are able to really kind of create these opportunities in places where we see development happening, where we have good schools, low crime rate, where we do see kind of resource-rich environments. I think these aren't just issues of justice and equity, but they're also policies that can really help drive longer-term outcomes, especially for the most vulnerable families. So I think when you're thinking about policies like inclusionary housing, right, it is something that is a powerful mechanism to create really integrated housing in areas where we're already seeing development, in areas where I think we assume there is real access to opportunity.
Yeah, so interesting to think about as we see conversations include maybe in lieu or on-site options for developers. So such a insightful, I think, line of thinking for us. So thanks so much, David. Sarah, Matt, of course, please weigh in on location or how it may come up in your conversations in your community. I don't want to stop the conversation here. Sarah, I'll come to you if I don't see any unmuting. But from your perspective in real estate, how has inclusionary housing and the affordability conversation impacted you all in your experience now?
Yeah, so I think, when we're focused on the development of mixed income housing across the country, places where there are inclusionary policies, it starts to lay the groundwork for the conversation that we're having around the benefits of mixed income, thinking about, everything David was just saying as it relates to location matters, access to opportunity, access to transit and other community assets, we think is fundamental for really encouraging social sustainability and the sustainability of our urban environments that have a diverse range of households across the income spectrum. In places where there are inclusionary policies, that some of the groundwork has already been laid as we kind of enter in and think about the development of those projects. And in many cases, whether it be the financial or the zoning side as it relates to density bonuses, they help to encourage our project, and capital that's seeking these projects out is better positioned in those types of situations. In my time as the director of planning in Boston, it was really interesting to see how we could layer on some incentive inclusionary on top of our mandatory inclusionary. So in a city where you already have a blanket mandatory inclusionary policy that is nuanced and has on-site and in lieu and other things based on districts, but when certain areas that we had identified from our citywide planning where we really wanted to densify housing and encourage more housing production, thinking about the utilization of density bonuses in those areas as we were rezoning allowed us to further augment our encouragement and shaping of what that housing supply would look like, and really change the nature of the conversation at a community planning level to be about a mixed income neighborhood that could evolve, as opposed to the fears of gentrification and displacement. Instead, thinking about the future of a neighborhood that had both the possibilities for people to stay in that neighborhood, to targeted, even within a city, those targeted ways that you can augment an inclusionary policy to further encourage things along that spectrum. And for us specifically, I really appreciate in the policy brief the speaking about some of the trade-offs and the trade-off between kind of the higher income bands and greater unit production, as opposed to deeper affordability and less production. And we had found that for us, those additional density bonuses were a very effective way for us to think about the workforce need, which was still very much below market in Boston, but was not being touched by other housing programs.
Interesting to hear about how we translate policy, how you translate policy into really the finance. How to lure in that capital. So interesting. Matthew, do you? I think in Portland, what type of information, do you hear, I guess like anecdotes like Sarah is giving from Portland? How do you grapple with the challenge that developers are in to attract capital while also holding, community advocate voices in mind, neighborhood association voices in mind? Can you describe for us how you do that balancing act?
Sure, I can try. That is a balancing act, and I think a theme in the report and a theme that we try and embrace at the Bureau is that for inclusionary housing programs to be successful, you need housing production in the city, so you need housing markets to be successful. We're not directly financing these units. These units are being financed by capital markets and being built by developers. And so we need to make sure that that market is functioning and facilitating well. In Portland, when we were structuring the program, we made sure we were very intentional and specific around the policy framework that we wanted the program to exist in. Speaking to your question about what communities we're interested in, we knew that communities were wanting deeper levels of affordability. Communities are wanting family-sized units. Communities have many kind of policy priorities that they have communicated to us over time as we've done various programs and initiatives and plans. So utilizing that as a policy framework, we're able to move into a calibration of the inclusionary housing program. And then we wanted to make sure it was grounded in economic realities. And so you need to work with private sector partners, you need to work with community partners. We brought in technical experts to do residual land value analyses and various other return analyses to really understand the impact of including the inclusionary housing units in a project. And then to the extent possible, trying to offset some of the costs of inclusionary housing units, in terms of reduced revenues over the life of the project. The city has not ever committed to fully offsetting those costs, but I think we have substantially offset them through density bonuses and waivers of various zoning requirements and property tax exemptions and SDC exemptions or impact fees for folks that may not call them SDCs. And it is a constant monitoring and a constant recalibration, adjusting it at the margins as the realities change. I think one of the things about inclusionary housing policies as a zoning requirement that is unique amongst zoning requirements and other kind of local public goods that are produced via the zoning code is, at least in Portland, we substantially are offsetting the cost imposed by the inclusionary housing regulations. And that isn't always the case about other zoning requirements. And so we're tracking it very closely, and we make adjustments as needed. I guess I will also mention your question on challenges. I think one of the challenges is also we have, partners in the private sector that have very different business models, and those business models can really affect how they're approaching an analysis of a project and the return on a project, whether or not they're developing and holding it in the long term, or they're developing it with the intent to sell in the short term. And, we obviously need to have one program structure across the entire Portland market. And the more we can have, honest and transparent conversations with our private sector partners about kind of the structure of how they're looking at the project and looking at their investment, the better we can structure the program.
Yeah, thanks so much. A lot to balance. And I guess it's nice to have you, Sarah, on the panel as someone who has been in public service, but has made, you've seen the policy, you've been in the community conversations and the balancing act, and now you're helping to really translate the policy work into projects on the ground. So is there any, in the role that you have now, are there any interesting learned lessons as you kind of look back on or look ahead to the 138 inclusionary housing policies in Massachusetts? I guess just share with us how you think about that now.
And I'm not sure I have a full answer. Curious if others on the panel do. I think I'm now struck with how important that constant recalibration is, and how different an inclusionary policy is compared to other pieces of our zoning, in part because there are so many things that are shaping the financial feasibility of a project that live outside just the zoning envelope and the what's allowed to be built on the land. And so thinking through in a construction cost inflationary environment, in a constantly changing debt environment, and in a world where the market side of your residential reality is changing. So with increasing market rents and the like, what is the appropriate cadence for those recalibrations, and how do you structure that in so that there's enough predictability that things are embedded within, appropriately reflected in land value, but there's also enough flexibility so that you can evolve to those changing conditions. And I think that that's really one of those tough balancing acts we didn't have the answer for fully when I was in the city. Certainly we would reevaluate the policy on a regular basis, every 4 to 5 years, but sometimes that might not be quite enough. So how do you build in those moments for flexibility in a world that also very much needs the predictability to make sure you have the appropriate requirements imputed in land values and the like?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The surrounding conditions, the maybe for some communities, right, revitalization, or I guess investment, the holistic approach to community makes me want to go to David next, because your work in Detroit really focused on revitalization of communities, affordable housing being one piece of that conversation. And now we're seeing, in the past decade, Detroit introducing several housing initiatives, many of which you were directly involved with. So would just love to hear your thoughts about, any advice you have for local and state policymakers on this Zoom for how they, how you approach those initiatives, and lessons learned that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, no. So I think one point that comes to me just hearing this conversation, both kind of with Matthew and Sarah's perspective, coming from Boston and Portland, right? These are cities and communities that I think are national leaders in planning and kind of thinking holistically about what the future looks like for their communities. And I think in some ways, Detroit became that out of necessity, right? So I joined the mayor's office when we were going through bankruptcy, right? To kind of like 50 years of population loss, literally the physical infrastructure of the city was struggling. So we were kind of forced to think holistically, because obviously what we had been doing hadn't been working for a very long time. So I think it gave us a unique opportunity to get to really think holistically in ways that I think other cities don't necessarily have to. But I think from what I saw from that was when you actually kind of lay out a broader vision, right? Broader goals for what you want to see your neighborhoods transform into, I think it can kind of help make the project by project conversations easier. Because I think, there is always this demand for like extremely deep affordability. I think certain amenities that, are extremely important for our neighborhoods, but, a developer can't likely, put that entirely, on their particular project. So I think, again, you see places like Boston, places like Portland, I think their policies work because they're proactively planning. They're thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and then are able to kind of more efficiently work through because they have a broader framework. And I think, again, I think that IH policies can fit within those broader frameworks. But I think my overall takeaway is that if the more holistically you're able to think about these issues, I think that can really support productive community conversations where, each individual project doesn't have to be everything to everyone, but as long as it's fitting within that broader context, I think it can kind of help you have those more nuanced conversations about, affordability might mean this in this project, but we're going to really push on it in these other projects in these other places. So I think just having that long-term vision, I think, can be extremely helpful in these conversations.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And thanks so much for your leadership on those initiatives. Matt, you talked a bit about some of the funding, some of the financial offsets that the city is offering alongside the policy options for your inclusionary housing program. I'm curious for all of our panelists, are you seeing other cities that you're working in have that type of financial or funding opportunity alongside the density bonus, or I think if there are incentives in the code for the city?
To be honest, it's probably been a couple of years since I've had a more comprehensive understanding of what was going on around the country, because it was something that our city council wanted to hear as we were working on our program for adoption in 2017. At the time, I remember that Portland's offset or incentive package was one of the more robust in the country. And we provided FAR bonuses and height bonuses in some cases. We provided waivers of parking requirements, and as I mentioned, waivers of system development charges and property tax exemptions and construction excise tax exemptions. So it's quite a bundle of incentives. I think that, as Mike talked about, and as we see in the report, that one of the things I think that I'm particularly proud about the Portland program is the economic calibration we went through. Our program, the state statute that authorized local municipalities to adopt inclusionary housing programs set the floor at 80% of median income. So cities could not require affordability below 80%. The city had a policy priority to get to 60% of the median income. And so we calibrated the program with the appropriate requirements and incentives to try and reach 60% affordability on a voluntary basis. And if developers opted for that, they would fulfill their inclusionary housing requirement. What we have seen is that 2/3 of all the inclusionary housing units that have been produced since the program went into effect in 2017 have been at the 60% level. And I think that speaks to the calibration versus the 80% program, the power of the full property tax exemption, and really offsetting some of the losses on the return from the rents over time. And so I hear more jurisdictions looking at the Portland model and talking about property tax exemptions. Certainly this report and the people who contributed to it are speaking to the strength of that. And so, hopefully as we have learned from other jurisdictions, some jurisdictions can learn from us. And as the programs keep improving around the country, we can all just keep learning from each other and making them, more effective at both producing market rate housing and inclusionary housing units.
So just to add on that, and some other areas, things that we've seen in the tools in Boston, we used primarily density bonus on top of mandatory, and did not touch into property tax abatement. And that's a longer conversation around some of the political realities in Boston as it relates to budget and fisc. But I think we increasingly see a variety of different kind of combinations or menus of options in other cities as we're developing projects now with M Squared. Many of the tools that were listed here in the policy brief, but in addition to density bonuses, things like expedited permitting or relief of permitting fees, in development, time is money, so that expediting or certainty in entitlement process certainly makes a big difference in terms of attracting capital to a project and financial feasibility. Another is specifically in certain locations where mixed income is encouraged, thinking about the waiver of parking requirements or reduced parking requirements. But I think across the board, one of the most powerful tools truly is the property tax abatement. I mean, that really does play out in terms of the financial analysis that we do on individual projects across the country. And so I think it's really helpful to see that analyzed with some hard data here as you look at the various trade-offs, but the power of that to encourage specific policy priorities it truly is, I think, the most powerful thing we see in cities across the country.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I'm going to shift over to our Q&A section. We're getting some great questions from folks. And also looks like in the chat, a shout out to Circulate San Diego. So great to have San Diego represented in the Zoom. So I'd like to, I think we have a futurist type of question, which I think, I think all of you are very well positioned to answer. And the question is, housing is often an area where policy and policy reactions move relatively slowly. What are some of the housing trends you all think may impact inclusionary housing in the next 10, 20 years?
I mean, I'll jump in. Why not? I'll jump in. We track the Portland housing market and Portland communities pretty closely. We try to, in order to inform policy makers on our city council and our various partner agencies working on either broad-based housing policy or affordable housing policy. One thing we've continued to see in Portland, which I don't think is unique to Portland, is that the growth in the cost of rental housing versus the growth in the incomes for renters is, it's divergent. And, we just, for another project, looked at it from 2000 through 2021, and the gap is growing. And I think if that continues to grow, we're only going to continue to experience a affordability crisis locally, which will have implications for displacement of vulnerable communities, will have implications for people experiencing homelessness in our communities, and so it will have implications for the city. And so that's, I don't know if that's going to keep growing. It certainly has been the trend for the last couple of decades in Portland, and if it continues, we're going to have to continue to grapple with that. And to some of what we've talked about today, housing is financed through capital markets, and we want to try and create broad-based housing policies, including inclusionary housing policies that facilitate production. And at some point, though, households are just going to become too cost burdened to be able to live in Portland proper. And then we could talk about regional, but that's a whole other conversation as well.
Well, one quick thought there. I think that leveraging housing choice vouchers more effectively, I think, is an interesting space to keep in mind as well. Just because I think the housing market moves very, very, very rapidly. Sometimes government policy doesn't move as quickly. It takes time to build new developments, whereas vouchers that move along with individual households, I think, can be used in more flexible ways. So I think kind of thinking through how we can incorporate the use of vouchers into developments, how we encourage their use in suburban neighborhoods with good schools, but also in urban neighborhoods as well. Make sure that those voucher policies keep up with rental rates in communities as well. But I think that can be an interesting and kind of flexible tool that can complement these policies that are kind of more focused on housing production and development.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would add, I think that the inclusionary housing policies are a particularly valuable tool when we think about the housing needs for essential workers, and for essential workers that often aren't in high-cost cities, are not touched by some of the existing housing programs that are more targeted to the deeply affordable and housing insecure, but are essential for our economies operating and functioning. And I think many people don't necessarily, even in conversations with communities, don't necessarily realize how housing a nurse and a fireman or a police officer and a teacher, and what they can afford and can't afford, and really thinking about those households and attaching them to people. Inclusion, I think across the board, when we have conversations as planners and communities, people want places for those households to live and very much value them, yet they're not being touched by a lot of the policies. And I think that there's ways to calibrate your inclusionary policies to make sure that that's a portion of the population that's being addressed.
Well, you see a few questions focused on community activism and really, I think the democratic process surrounding this conversation around the policy and the development. So how, what advice do you have for activists, working with local community leaders and developers to support the goal of developing more inclusionary housing?
In many ways, I think that there's the conversations that we started off with, that David started off with, as it relates to access to opportunity, and what that means in terms of thinking about where housing is being developed and being very intentional about where we're encouraging that housing development across the income spectrum. I think the other piece of it all that I think is really helpful to look at, and maybe additional policy briefs that can be done, but thinking about how economic inclusion in residential projects creates healthier communities across the board. And I think that there is data that shows, there isn't necessarily increased crime rate or other things that people may assume would happen if you have mixed income properties in your neighborhood, and instead focusing on what that does to the quality of life for everyone who's living in that development. I think the more we can look at data to think about, how that is playing out in reality on the ground is really important and can be a valuable tool in those conversations.
And I think maybe related to that, but on the other side, is that I think kind of continuing to push for kind of thoughtful, holistic policies and plans in communities, and then maybe kind of giving government, let's say, a little bit of kind of slack on the individual project basis, because I think there's also something to be said for kind of integrated buildings, neighborhoods, communities where it might not be 50% deeply affordable, but actually 20%, in some ways kind of creates that neighborhood mix that might actually be more healthy for everyone. So again, I think you always need to kind of push and be that advocate, but I think pushing on the broader holistic vision, while I think kind of not discounting lower levels of affordability in individual projects.
I would just echo, I think the more you can move away from an individual project to a broader plan and a broader neighborhood citywide aspiration, I think that does truly help. You'll have the harder fights will be had at the individual project level, but there can be more consensus around the goals as it relates to a community, a neighborhood, a citywide type of a plan.
I think to this question also, so that's so helpful to hear the holistic, like the advocacy towards a holistic vision. Is there anything, Sarah, as you go to build and finance these projects that benefit the community, right? Or David, as you see projects that provide the social impact for communities in these high opportunity areas, is there anything that a neighborhood association or an elected official can do to help you be more competitive in that kind of behind the scenes more pitch for investors? Does that type of letter of support or even meetings, does it make a difference? It's okay if not. It just
yeah. I think the biggest thing that I'm going to put my real estate developer hat on for a second, but as much as you can have predictability in an entitlement approval process and move from identifying a place where you think there's a great potential for a project to actually being able to get in the ground. And I think, unfortunately, so many great projects get caught up in very long processes, whether they need a zoning change or there's just a community planning process, and not to in any way downplay the importance of community process, but if that community process can be done in a broader plan as opposed to an individual project, so you know what's predictable and you can see the pathway to getting in the ground, that makes a big difference, and that certainly helps attract more private capital.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing so many, really local movements, but across the nation say yes to more housing, yes to these mixed income projects. This is what our community deserves. This is what our community needs. So, the more that voice adds to other voices before city halls or even in front of developer in those local land use hearings, that from the Portland perspective, it makes a difference. It really does matter to turn out to provide that predictability so we see these projects happen.
I think just to echo that briefly, this is me putting my mayor's office hat back on. I think if there are people who would like to be, the yes in my backyard advocates at local city council meetings, I'm pretty sure developers will be happy about that.
Well, let me see. There's more. Thank you all for sending in really great questions. I think we're at time though for our panelists. And so I will turn it back over to Mike to help close us out, and just want to thank our panelists so much, but I'm sure Mike will do the formal thank yous.
Well, no, Sam, thank you for your leadership and moderation of this exciting and really important conversation. And David, Sarah, and Matthew, thank you all for your insights and your wisdom and your perspectives in this conversation. And I'd just like to share thank you to all attendees on today's second Up for Growth pro-housing policy webinar. We're really excited in the months to come to feature a couple of exciting programs down the road. Here in June, we will be hosting a webinar focused on, so you've passed ADU reform, now what? Conversation around innovative implementation approaches taken from experts from around the country. So keep your eye out for an announcement on that soon. And then in July, Up for Growth will be rolling out our brand new rebooted Housing Under Production in the U.S. report. Tremendous case-making research that evaluates the extent to which America faces an underproduction of homes and the opportunities for policymakers, advocates, and practitioners to move the needle on addressing this critical policy issue facing communities large and small, urban and rural. So thank you all again. And last but not least, if your organization is not yet involved in Up for Growth, I would encourage you to contact us by going to the Up for Growth website /membership. Our team would love to talk with you, learn more about your work on the ground and how our organization can be a resource to Sam's point. How do we get to yes? How do we get more housing out of the ground to meet those unique community needs? So thank you all again. And until next time, appreciate your engagement and look forward to continuing the conversation. Take care.